In the long run-up to the climax of our great saga, we've made a lot of memorable characters. You poured a piece of yourself into each one, and you love them all for different reasons. Now we have to murder them in a manner most foul. Let's make sure that our character deaths mean as much to our audience as it does to us. I'm author DC Fergerson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. Before we get started, let me talk to all you authors out there. Are you just getting started? Were you looking to build a newsletter subscription or grow your fan base? Well, Art of the Arcane is offering managed promotion services through BookFunnel. You get a BookFunnel membership and management of your newsletter to build out your subscribers, and all you need to do is stay in touch with them. I'm using it myself, and I have a link to the description down below if you'd like to try it out. The most tragic part of life is that it ends eventually. The worst mistake we can make as writers is to handle the gravity of that tragedy without its proper due. Whether it's dismissing a loved one by vowing revenge with a cheesy one-liner, ignoring it completely by the next scene, or shoving loved ones into refrigerators to advance the plot, there are so many ways to mess this up. The one way that you can feel somewhat safe, or at least that you're on the right track, is the death of a character should evoke emotion in you, the writer. After all, this character is your baby. You created them. Their death should sting you the most. So, how do we build toward that? When do we commit to killing a character? How do we give their death meaning? And can you purposefully create a character to die? These are topics that we want to dig into, but before we get into that, understanding context is everything. When a character dies, the ripple effect that death causes, and the audience reaction to it, are going to be directly related to when the death takes place. Act 1 deaths, for example, usually happen so early on that it's on us as storytellers to make certain that the audience knows this character and their relationship to the story enough that the death has some impact, even though there wasn't a lot of time for characterization. Deaths that happen in the second act usually occur at the drop, when all hope is lost. These are characters that are often an ally or a mentor, so when they die, it should have a significant impact on the reader, because they've spent so much time in the two acts to grow with the protagonist to become a valued part of your cast. When we get into Act 3 deaths, these are often shocking, usually the price paid in exchange for the protagonist's victory. An entire story's worth of characterization led to this point. We were already past the point of the Act 2 drop. The audience is lulled into a false sense of security, and then boom, a character dies. Out of all of these, Act 2 deaths are the easiest to do, and both Act 1 and Act 3 deaths are incredibly easy to screw up. As you're going to see, timing is everything. So, let's start with a character that's intended to die in Act 1. Most of the time, these deaths are used to facilitate the protagonist's backstory, or to become the inciting event that leads to the hero's call to action. Tales that start off with Act 1 deaths vary greatly, but let's go over some quick examples that you may or may not know. So we're going to touch on Star Wars, It, Back to the Future, and then there's Little Old Me with Project Phoenix. Now, we're going to compare and contrast these to highlight differences as to what makes one good and what makes a bad one bad. The answer might surprise you. So, Luke Skywalker hates being in the desert, but he has chores to do that prevent him from leaving his home planet. That is, of course, until his aunt and uncle are brutally incinerated by the Empire. In It, our protagonist Bill is at home in bed and makes a paper sailboat for his little brother Georgie. Our great evil, Pennywise the Clown, brutally murders Georgie while he's playing outside. This has a ripple effect with Bill when Pennywise starts going after other local children, and it's the driving force that makes Bill a leader of the group of kids trying to stop Pennywise. Back to the Future sees Marty McFly lose the eccentric Doc Brown in the opening story, using his time machine to evade the same men that killed him. Inadvertently, he ends up back in 1955 where Doc is still alive, and seeks him out to help him get back to the future. The threat of Doc's death hangs over him like a dark cloud that only gets bigger the closer he gets to going back home. Project Phoenix sees protagonist Cora Blake as the youngest member of an NSA team. Successful in their mission, they're about to hand off the data they've worked 2 years to collect. When a strange phone call holds up Cora from getting to the meet, she arrives late to find her entire team is dead. Among them is her mentor and the team lead, Richard. These deaths propel Cora forward as she tries to unravel the secret her team died for. Now, I just broke down the Act 1 intros of 4 separate pieces of work. Which do you think has a death that is virtually ignored, handled incorrectly, has no lasting effects on the plot, and is barely ever spoken about again? If you guessed Star Wars, give yourself a pat on the back. The intro death in Star Wars is a classic example of a character death done as a plot device. It is never spoken of, nor does it ever affect the plot of the story again within about 2 minutes of it happening. Luke never talks about it, it never affects his decisions, he doesn't even really mention it. In every other example, these deaths haunt our protagonists. They are either a motivating factor or a cloud hanging over them, or both, for the entirety of the story, and the writer never lets you forget it. The proof is in the pudding. In the intros leading to their deaths, Doc Brown is an eccentric scientist that is friends with Marty and invites him to witness his latest invention. He gives thought to where humanity's going and the wonders he'll see traveling to the past and future alike. Georgie is a sweet, naive young boy that adores and looks up to his older brother. Richard is a consummate professional that's been in the game for a very long time and is like a father figure to Cora. He has hopes that their work will be used to pressure the dragon Lucius diplomatically rather than going into Germany guns blazing. With Star Wars, Luke's aunt and uncle are the people that took care of him all his life, and now they are dead so he can be a space wizard. So, as you can see, we can design a character to be killed from the get-go. It's all about how we handle the execution, no pun intended. Characterization is key here. You don't have a lot of time before you pull the trigger on these characters, so every word you use needs to be geared toward making the audience know enough about them to care. Death of itself is not tragic, and you can't afford to lean on that fact that someone dies for it to be enough of an impact that the audience cares. Now, let's look at a second act death. Second act deaths, as I mentioned earlier, are already well positioned in the story to enable us to pull them off pretty easy. As we know, the drop at the end of Act 2, when it looks like all hope is lost and we'll never defeat the big bad guy, is exactly when it's ideal to let an important character go. Now again, we're revisiting Star Wars, as Obi-Wan's death does occur at the Act 2 drop, but let's also look at Top Gun, Iron Eagle, and Lord of the Rings. Now, I'll talk us through this one because it might be a little subtle to see which example goes off the rails. With Star Wars, we know that there's a great duel where Obi-Wan makes a desperate bid to keep Vader distracted while Luke and company get off the Death Star. Surrendering himself to death, he is spiritually rewarded by becoming a Force ghost to assist Luke in the Act 3 climax. This propels our hero forward to use all the strength his mentor has given him to overcome the evil Empire. In Top Gun, Maverick plays fast and loose with the rules, in part being a hotshot risk-taking adrenaline junkie that has something to prove, and the other part thinking he's invincible. When his plane goes into a flat spin, both Maverick and his partner Goose eject, but Goose strikes his head on the canopy, killing him before he ever hits the water. Death touches Maverick and shows he isn't invincible at all. This wake-up call rattles him and it affects everything he does in Act 3. With Iron Eagle, young Doug convinces retired pilot Chappie Sinclair to steal 2 military planes and go into enemy territory to save his father because the US government will not. Only, as the mission's about to start, Chappie's plane is shot down and Doug is forced to go it alone. Now, this death is subverted. Though the ripple does go into the Act 3 climax, we'll later find out that Chappie bailed from the aircraft and survived. The same is true with Lord of the Rings. Gandalf sacrifices himself against the Baelor in order for Frodo and the Fellowship to escape. Despite the fact that this death is subverted, it doesn't happen in the first or second book. Instead, Gandalf becomes another casualty in a long line of high stakes in Book 1 to get Frodo to Mount Doom, and the ripple weighs heavily on Frodo. So, what lesson can we learn from these? This time, it isn't from Star Wars. Obi-Wan's character death is about as perfect as you could get. Top Gun as well. Goose's death is not a plot device. It was our protagonist's darkest moment, one where he would have traded his own life for his best friend in a heartbeat. We know enough about the character to know that. I'm pretty sure you've also guessed I'm not going to start tearing down Lord of the Rings. Critique maybe, but I'm never going to cite it as a bad example of anything. So yeah, it's Iron Eagle, and here's why. In the particular death scene for Chappie, he knows he's going down, and he tells Doug. With some final brave words, he spurs Doug on to victory, and his radio goes dead. What we have here is a false tension, only because the death is subverted later on. There's no point where Chappie says over the radio, hey, I'm going to try and bail out over the water of the Mediterranean Sea, good luck, you got this. But that's exactly what happens later on when we find out he's alive. It's just plain silly. Here, what we're doing is we're loving a character too much to kill them, but wanting our hero's victory to be his own without his mentor. Unfortunately, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If the writer had picked one lane and stuck with it, then the story would not have suffered for it. Instead, trying to have it both ways leaves your audience feeling cheated by the nonsensical, don't worry, it's cool, everybody wins, ending that makes the victory have no cost at all. This is an important lesson. Deaths, especially in Act 2, are going to spur our protagonist onward. The effects are damaging, and we don't know if we can beat this big guy without our mentor, our ally, our best friend, or our love interest. Our audience may love this character as much as we do, and yes, killing them is going to hurt, but you have to commit to it. If you plan to subvert their death, just make sure that the window of opportunity for them to have survived is there. Like, let's be honest here. Everyone knew it wasn't a coincidence that Melisandre shows up at Castle Black just before Jon Snow got killed in Game of Thrones. It was the worst kept secret of the book's ending, and we knew it was coming when the new season of the show started. Maybe don't make it that obvious, but if you're subverting death, open the door a crack. Third act deaths are a bitter pill to swallow. They divide into two camps. The deaths we knew were coming because the story was set in flashback, or they come quick and sudden, a painful last cost inches from the finish line. In order to examine that, let's talk about Titanic, Of Mice and Men, Serenity, and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Boy, is that a mixed bag, isn't it? Once again, we're looking for where one of these things isn't like the others. In Titanic, the titular ship is going down. Jack and Rose get to safety, where he keeps her alive in the frigid sea aboard a door and then perishes to exposure. There are plenty of things about this movie that are worth critiquing, but I'll tell you this much. This was the ultimate date movie in '97. I ought to know. I took my girlfriend to see it twice, and she's still married to me. I'm not saying the movie did that, I'm just saying it didn't hurt. Of Mice and Men, jeez. This is one of my top 10 favorite books of all time, period. George and Lenny are a pair of migrant workers wandering the United States for farm work during the Great Depression. Lenny is mentally challenged but massive and as strong as two men, while having the naivety and gentleness of a child. George looks after him wherever they go together, always dreaming of the day that they can have their own land, work their own farm together, and live for themselves. All of that is cut short when Lenny accidentally kills a woman. On the run with a posse looking for them, George is left with no choice but to kill Lenny himself rather than let the mob lynch him. This is one of the most heartbreaking deaths I've ever read, and if you can find it, the Gary Sinise and John Malkovich film adaptation captures the spirit and the words of the book so perfectly. Serenity's Act 3 sees the ship mar itself to look like a scrap reaver ship, hiding among the scavenging monsters until they spring their trap, flying the ship at top speed like bait as they rush toward their enemy, tying up both sides in a massive space battle while Serenity flees to the planet below. The ship damaged, our brave pilot Vash brings her in for a crash landing and pulls it off, coming to a complete stop with the entire crew intact. As they're about to disembark, a spike of metal crashes through the window and impales Vash, killing him instantly. A moment of silence, please. Now, I chose The Amazing Spider-Man 2 not because it's a great film. It isn't. Nor did I choose it because it was well written. Because it isn't. The thing is, if you're a comic book fan, you didn't have to see anything but this image in the trailer to know they were recreating one of the most iconic scenes in Spider-Man's rich history. Peter Parker's girlfriend, Gwen Stacy, arrives on the scene as Green Goblin and Electro are making his life difficult. With no powers of which to speak, she gets herself in the crossfire. Peter has to juggle battling two enemies and protecting Gwen. But at the climax of the final battle, Gwen falls through the roof of a building, down an elevator shaft or something. Peter fires off a web, catches her, pulls on the web with everything he has, and he's about 6 inches too short. Her head bounces off the ground or her neck snaps. The point is, it was a sudden death at the very end of the battle. So, this one you may or may not have spotted the problem unless you've seen all 4 films. But our problem here is actually Serenity. Jack died protecting the woman that he loved in a wreck that saw 1,500 people die in a single night. George killing Lenny was a mercy killing, one he would have to regret and live with for the rest of his life. Try though he might, Peter Parker learned that no matter how much he loves anyone, he'll never be able to save every person every time. Vash died because writer Joss Whedon wanted to shock the audience. Period. There is no plot point that this serves. There is no event that lends context to it. There is not a single point where the audience nor the characters are allowed to grieve his death until well after the climax is over. In short, he died for no actual reason that was relevant to the plot. It was purely done for shock value. This is not only disrespectful to a character, but plain bad writing. It's weird and frustrating with this particular example because otherwise the film is actually phenomenally written and an enjoyable ending to the canceled series Firefly. Like the death of Quicksilver in Avengers Age of Ultron, also Joss Whedon in case you were wondering, deaths that feel tacked on and unexpected are often out of place because they don't serve the narrative at all and actually hurt suspension of disbelief because audiences aren't stupid. They know when you've made a choice to shock them, and it sticks out like a sore thumb. So, the lesson here is that while the death may come as a shock in Act 3, it should never, I repeat, never be done purely for shock value. We miss you, Vash. Character deaths are one of the hardest things to write, both traumatic to us as writers, killing one of our babies, but also to our audience. Serving up that death, it's on you to make your audience care about the character as much as you do, and dial it up to that great level of gut punch that we're looking for. Most of all, though, their death should have meaning. Once again, the donations from you guys are so awesome, and I thank you so much. We're still working with a Boston-based needs organization to get this beautiful lady a service dog. Her name is Liana. She's 11 and on the spectrum. This wonderful person is my little girl, and if you'd like to help out, there's a link in the comments down below. Also, while you're down there, don't forget to sign up for my newsletter. It's in the comments too, and you're going to get Cora Blake, Arcane Agent, totally free. You'll get cool news about what I'm working on in books and here on the channel, and it comes loaded with cool authors and promotions for fantasy and sci-fi. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos, and as always, I'm DC Fergerson. Now have fun and get crafting.